June 10, 1912, Wieliska, Iowa, a small, quiet farming town where everyone knows everyone, a place where neighbors share meals, children play in the streets until dark, and the biggest worry is whether the corn harvest will come in on time. But, on this particular night, something unspeakable happened inside a modest two-story house on East 2nd Street, something so brutal, so horrifying, so utterly without explanation, that over 100 years later, people are still losing sleep over it. 8 people, one house, one axe, and a murderer who was never, officially, caught. What you are about to hear is not a ghost story made up to scare children. This is not fiction. Every single detail I am about to share with you is documented. It is real, it happened, and it could have happened to anyone. Welcome to the true story of the Wieliska axe murders, the single deadliest night in Iowa history, and one of the most haunting unsolved mass murders in American history. To understand the horror of what happened on June 10, 1912, you first need to understand the world it happened in. The year is 1912. The place is Wieliska, a small town in Montgomery County, Iowa, with a population of just over 2,000 people. This is a world without smartphones, without security cameras, without DNA testing. Crime investigation is in its absolute infancy. Police rely on eyewitness accounts, confessions, and gut instinct. Forensic science, as we know it, simply does not exist yet. Wieliska is a railroad town. The Chicago, Burlington and Quincy Railroad runs right through it, bringing commerce and travelers from all over. The town is a hotel, a bank, several churches, a school, and dozens of homes lined up neatly along gravel roads. The people here are hardworking, proud, religious. They trust their neighbors. They leave their doors unlocked. They wave to strangers walking down the street. It is, by all accounts, exactly the kind of place where nothing bad ever happens. That illusion of safety would be shattered forever on a Sunday night in June. The family at the center of this story is the Moore family. Josiah Bowers Moore, known to everyone as Joe, was 43 years old. He was a well-respected businessman who dealt in farm implements. He was a pillar of the community, a deacon in the local Presbyterian church, a man who coached his children's baseball team. His wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, was 39 years old. By all accounts, she was a devoted mother, an excellent cook, and deeply involved in the church community. She was the kind of woman who always had an extra place set at the dinner table for anyone who needed it. Together, Joe and Sarah had 6 children. Herman, the eldest, was 11 years old. Mary Catherine was 10. Arthur Boyd was 7. Paul Vernon was 5. Boyd was 3. And little Lena Gertrude, the baby of the family, was just 7 years old. 6 children, a loving mother, a hard-working father, a beautiful home, a full life ahead of them. Every single one of them would be dead within 24 hours. But it wasn't just the Moore family in that house that night. 2 additional children had been invited to sleep over. Their names were Lena Stillinger, age 12, and her younger sister Ina Mae Stillinger, age 8. They were daughters of a local farmer named Joseph Stillinger. The Stillinger girls had attended a Children's Day program at the Presbyterian church with the Moore children earlier that evening. After the program ended, they were invited by the Moores to spend the night rather than make the long walk back to their farm in the dark. Their parents said yes. Why wouldn't they? The Moores were safe people. The town was safe. It was just one night. Lena and Ina went home with the Moores, brushed their teeth, said their prayers, and climbed into bed in the downstairs guest room. It was a sleepover. It was supposed to be fun. Instead, it was the last night of their lives. 8 people, 2 adults, 6 children, all of them tucked into their beds, in a locked house, in a quiet town, on a warm summer night. None of them would see the morning. The evening of Sunday, June 9, 1912 begins like any other Sunday in Wieliska. Church in the morning, a big family lunch, afternoon rest. And then, in the evening, the big event of the week, the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church of Wieliska. The program is a joyful celebration of the church's children. There are songs, recitations, performances. The entire Moore family attends. Joe Moore is beaming with pride watching his children perform. Sarah helps with the refreshments. The Stillinger girls are there too, participating in the program alongside their schoolmates. The program ends around 9:30 p.m. Joe and Sarah invite Lena and Ina Stillinger to spend the night. Since their farm is a considerable distance away, the invitation is accepted. The group walks home together through the warm June night, the children laughing and chattering, exhausted from the excitement of the evening. Neighbors would later recall seeing the Moores walking home. They seemed happy, normal. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, to suggest that anything was wrong. By 10 p.m., the entire household is in bed, Joe and Sarah in their room, the children in their rooms, the Stillinger girls in the downstairs guest room. The house goes dark, the town goes quiet, and then the killer enters. Based on the crime scene investigation, forensic analysis, and testimony gathered over decades, investigators and historians have reconstructed what happened inside the Moore house that night. What follows is that reconstruction. The killer entered the house sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight. They likely entered through an unlocked door because in 1912 Villisca, people often did not lock their doors, or the killer may have been let in by Joe Moore himself, which would explain the lack of forced entry. The killer moved silently through the darkened house. They knew the layout, or they took their time learning it. They moved first to the master bedroom, where Joe and Sarah Moore slept. Joe Moore was struck first. He was asleep, completely defenseless. The killer raised a long-handled axe, Joe's own axe, taken from his cob house in the backyard, and delivered a series of devastating blows to Joe's head. Joe never had time to cry out. Sarah Moore was struck next. As she lay beside her husband, she too never woke up. Or if she did, it was only for the briefest, most terrifying fraction of a second before the darkness took her. Then the killer moved upstairs, to the children's rooms. Herman, age 11, Mary Catherine, age 10, Arthur, age 7, Paul, age 5, Boyd, age 3. All of them asleep, all of them struck in their beds, in the same manner as their parents, all of them dead before they could make a sound. Then the killer descended the stairs and entered the guest room, where the Stillinger girls slept. Lena, age 12, and Ina, age 8. They too were killed in their sleep. 8 people, murdered in their beds, in near total silence, without a single scream loud enough to wake the neighbors. How is that possible? How does someone kill 8 people in a house in a residential neighborhood, without anyone hearing anything? It is one of the many questions that has haunted this case for over a century. After the murders, the killer did something extraordinary, something that tells us a great deal about their psychology, though investigators have debated for 100 years what exactly it means. First, all the mirrors in the house were covered with clothing or cloth, every single one. In 1912, covering mirrors after a death was a common mourning ritual, a sign of respect for the dead. Did the killer feel guilt? Were they following some twisted ritual? Or were they simply afraid of seeing their own reflection? Second, all the curtains and window shades in the house were drawn closed. The killer did not want anyone seeing in, or perhaps they did not want to be seen as they lingered inside. Third, and this is perhaps the most disturbing detail of all, the killer stayed in the house. After murdering 8 people, they did not flee immediately. Evidence suggests the killer ate food from the Moore family's kitchen. Slices from a side of bacon were found partially consumed. The killer sat in the home of their victims and ate a meal. A 2-pound slab of unsmoked bacon was found near Lena Stillinger's body. Its purpose has never been explained. The axe was washed. Partially, it was found propped against the wall of the downstairs bedroom, wiped but not fully cleaned. The killer made some attempt to remove evidence, but did not complete the job. A cigarette butt was found in the attic. Someone had been up there, watching, waiting, perhaps before the murders, perhaps after, perhaps both. This is not the work of a panicked attacker who stumbled upon a house and made a desperate decision. This is calculated, methodical, almost ritualistic. The killer knew what they were doing, and they were in absolutely no hurry. Monday morning, June 10, 1912, the sun rises over Villisca. It is a beautiful, clear summer morning. People are going about their business. The milkman makes his rounds, farmers head to their fields, children get ready for school. No one knows yet. The town wakes up completely unaware that 8 of its residents are already dead, lying in their beds less than a mile from where people are eating breakfast, brewing coffee, reading the morning paper. The first sign that something is wrong comes from a neighbor named Mary Peckham. She lives next door to the Moores and is accustomed to seeing Joe Moore up and working in his yard by early morning. But this morning, Joe does not appear. The yard is empty. The curtains are still drawn. There is no smoke from the chimney. By 8 a.m., Mary is concerned. She tries knocking on the door. No answer. She tries the door. It is locked. She walks around the house. All the curtains are drawn. She cannot see inside. She contacts Joe Moore's brother, Ross Moore, who lives nearby. Ross arrives with a key. He unlocks the front door and steps inside. What Ross Moore found inside that house would traumatize him for the rest of his life. He would never speak of it without his voice breaking. He would never truly recover from it. The downstairs was quiet. Too quiet. Ross called out for Joe. No answer. He noticed the drawn curtains, the eerie stillness. He moved toward the guest room. First, he opened the door. Inside, he found Lena Stillinger and Ina Stillinger, dead in their bed. Lena's arm was hanging over the edge of the mattress, her hand nearly touching the floor. The bedclothes were soaked dark. Ross staggered backward. He ran upstairs. He found the children, all 6 more children, dead in their beds. Then he found Joe and Sarah in the master bedroom. 8 people, all gone, all killed in their sleep. Ross Moore ran out of the house screaming. He collapsed in the front yard. His screams brought neighbors running. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered outside the Moore house. Mary Peckham would later say that when she saw Ross's face as he came out of the house, she knew before he said a single word. She knew that something inside that house was beyond description. The news spread through Villisca at the speed of human voices, which, in 1912, was surprisingly fast. By 9 a.m., hundreds of people had gathered on East 2nd Street. The town marshal, Hank Horton, arrived and attempted to secure the scene, but he was overwhelmed. People were pushing forward, trying to see inside. Some of them, and this will become critically important later, actually entered the house. Before proper investigation could begin. By the time the state investigators arrived hours later, the crime scene had been compromised by dozens of people who had walked through it. Evidence had been touched, footprints had been obscured. The chain of evidence, such as it was in 1912, was already broken. Across town, the Stillinger family was receiving the news that their 2 daughters were dead. Joseph Stillinger, the girl's father, reportedly had to be physically restrained when he was told their mother fainted. By nightfall, the news had reached newspapers as far away as Chicago and New York. The Villisca axe murders had become national news, and a town that had never known real violence would never, ever feel safe again. That night, people in Villisca barricaded their doors. Families refused to let children sleep upstairs. Men sat awake through the night with shotguns across their laps. The killer was still out there. No one had been arrested. No suspects had been named. Anyone could be next. The investigation into the Villisca axe murders was, by any modern standard, a catastrophe, and it is important to be fair here. Investigators in 1912 did not have the tools we have today. There was no DNA testing, no fingerprint databases, no forensic pathology as we understand it. They were working blind, with primitive tools, under enormous public pressure. But even accounting for the era, the investigation made critical mistakes that would doom any chance of a real resolution. The crime scene was never properly secured. Hundreds of citizens walked through the Moore house before investigators arrived. Any physical evidence that might have been present, hair, fibers, fingerprints, was hopelessly contaminated. The bodies were moved before they were properly documented. The axe was handled by multiple people before it was properly examined. Multiple law enforcement agencies, local, county, state, and even private detective agencies hired by the city, became involved. They did not coordinate well. They shared information poorly. At times, they worked at direct cross purposes, each trying to claim credit for solving the case. And hovering over all of it was the media. National newspapers sent reporters to Villisca. The coverage was sensational and often inaccurate. Rumors were printed as fact. Wild theories spread across the country. The public pressure to solve the case quickly led investigators to make premature accusations and pursue leads that led nowhere. The first major suspect in the Villisca case was a man named Frank Fernando Jones. Jones was, in many ways, the obvious suspect. He was a prominent local businessman, a state senator, in fact, and more importantly, he was Joe Moore's former employer. The 2 men had a bitter history. Years before the murders, Joe Moore had worked for Jones at his farm implement business. At some point, Moore left Jones's employment and set up his own competing business. Using knowledge and contacts that he had gained while working for Jones, Jones was furious. The 2 men had been bitter business rivals ever since. There was, also, according to some sources, a rumor of a personal relationship, deeply improper, deeply secretive, between members of the 2 families. The exact nature of this alleged connection was never established, but it was whispered about in Villisca for years. The theory was that Jones had hired someone to murder the Moore family, motivated by business rivalry, personal hatred, or both. Investigators hired by the city of Villisca spent years pursuing this theory. They believed Jones had hired a man named William Blackie Mansfield to commit the murders. Mansfield was a traveling drifter and sometime criminal with a dark reputation. He was investigated extensively. Investigators even claimed to have found evidence placing him near Villisca. On the night of the murders, a grand jury indicted Mansfield in 1916, 4 years after the murders, but the case fell apart. Witnesses recanted. Evidence proved insufficient. Mansfield was acquitted. Frank Jones was never charged. He denied any involvement until his death, and to this day, No one can say with certainty whether he was responsible or whether investigators simply needed someone to blame. The second major suspect is, if anything, even more disturbing than the first, because if he was the killer, it means a man of God committed these murders. His name was Reverend George Emmett Kelly, a traveling Presbyterian minister from Macedonia, Iowa. Kelly was in Biliska on the night of June 9th. He had attended the very same Children's Day program at the Presbyterian church that the Moore family had attended. He had interacted with the Moore family that evening. He knew them. He knew their house. He left Biliska on the 5 a.m. train the following morning, hours before the bodies were discovered. Years later, Kelly confessed, twice, in fact. He gave two separate written confessions to the murders, describing in detail how he had committed the crimes. In his confessions, Kelly described being seized by an irresistible urge, what he called a bloodlust, that he attributed to divine command. He claimed that God had told him to kill. He described entering the Moore house, taking the axe, and carrying out the murders in a state he described as something between a trance and a frenzy. Kelly was arrested and tried twice. The first trial ended in a hung jury. The second trial, in 1917, resulted in an acquittal. His defense attorneys successfully argued that his confessions were false, the product of a disturbed mind seeking attention, possibly a man who was mentally ill but not a murderer. Here is the thing that keeps investigators up at night. Both things could be true simultaneously. Kelly could have been genuinely mentally ill and genuinely guilty. His mental illness did not necessarily mean he was innocent. But in 1917, the law and the jury saw it differently. Kelly spent much of his remaining life in mental institutions. He died in 1930 without ever definitively clarifying whether his confessions were truth or fantasy. The question remains unanswered. To this day, one of the most compelling theories about the Biliska murders is that they were not an isolated incident, that the killer was a traveler, someone who moved from town to town, following the railroad lines, and that Biliska was simply one stop on a much longer and more terrible journey. Investigators who have studied this theory point to a series of similar axe murders that occurred across the American Midwest in the years surrounding 1912. The similarities are striking: multiple victims killed in their sleep, similar wounds, mirrors covered, curtains drawn, the killer apparently remaining at the scene for an extended period after the murders. In Colorado Springs, Colorado, in 1911, a family of 6 killed with an axe in their sleep. In Ardenwold, Oregon, in 1909, multiple victims. In Monmouth, Illinois, in 1914, a similar case. In Ellsworth, Kansas, in 1912, the very same year as Biliska, another family, another axe. Investigators who have studied these cases believe there may have been a single perpetrator, a traveling axe murderer who used the railroad system to move between crimes, making him nearly impossible to track with 1912 technology. Some researchers have identified a man named Henry Lee Moore, no relation to the Biliska Moors, as a possible candidate. Henry Lee Moore was convicted of axe murders in Columbia, Missouri in 1912. He was linked to similar crimes in Kansas and Colorado, but he was never definitively connected to the Biliska murders specifically. The traveling killer theory remains one of the most seriously considered explanations for what happened in Biliska, and if it is correct, it means the killer was never caught, never brought to justice, and simply continued until, eventually, he stopped for reasons we will never know. The house at 508 East 2nd Street in Biliska, Iowa still stands today, more than 100 years after the murders. It is still there, the same structure, largely unchanged. The Biliska Axe Murder House is now one of the most famous haunted locations in the United States, visited by thousands of paranormal investigators, ghost hunters, and horror enthusiasts every year. But here is what makes this different from most haunted houses. The evidence of something paranormal at this location is so consistently reported by so many independent witnesses over so many decades that it has become genuinely difficult to dismiss. The Moore family lived in the house for years before the murders. After the murders, several families attempted to live there. None stayed long. The house sat empty for extended periods throughout the 20th century, cycling through owners who could never quite bring themselves to stay. Throughout the decades, neighbors reported seeing lights moving in the windows of the empty house, the sound of children crying, or sometimes laughing, coming from within, a figure visible in the upstairs windows, standing perfectly still, watching the street below. The house is currently owned by Darwin and Martha Lynn, who purchased it in 1994 and restored it to its 1912 appearance. They operate it as a museum and allow overnight paranormal investigations. What has been reported by visitors over the years is extraordinary. Multiple independent paranormal investigation teams have captured audio recordings inside the house. that contained what appeared to be children's voices, whispering, sometimes crying, sometimes calling out names. In rooms where no children are present, investigators have reported their equipment, cameras, audio recorders, EMF meters, malfunctioning or shutting down completely inside certain rooms, particularly the children's rooms upstairs and the downstairs guest room where the Stillinger girls died. People who sleep in the house overnight, and yes, you can book overnight stays there, consistently report the same experiences across decades and across groups that have no connection to each other. A feeling of being watched, cold spots that appear and disappear without explanation, the sensation of a hand touching their face or arm in the darkness, and dreams so vivid and so horrifying that many guests leave before morning. In 2014, a visitor named Robert Stephen Lowerson Jr. was stabbed while investigating the house alone at night. He later claimed he had stabbed himself in a dissociative state brought on by the atmosphere of the house. He survived. He stated afterward that something in the house had taken control of him. Make of that what you will. Most chillingly, multiple visitors have reported seeing the apparition of a young girl, sometimes in the downstairs guest room, sometimes on the staircase, who appears solid, real, completely lifelike, until she simply is not there anymore. If the house is haunted, and I am going to let you make your own determination about that, then the question becomes, why? Why would these spirits remain? Why would children who live brief, innocent, happy lives be bound to the place where they were so brutally taken? Some paranormal researchers suggest it is not the children who haunt the house, but the trauma itself, that certain locations, soaked in enough violence and grief, develop what they call a residual haunting, a kind of psychic recording of the events that took place there, replaying endlessly like a broken record. Others believe the spirits of the Moore children and the Stillinger girls genuinely remain, perhaps because they are confused, because they do not understand what happened to them, because they fell asleep and never woke up and something in them is still waiting for morning. And there are those who believe the energy of the killer lingers too, that whatever drove a human being to commit those acts left a stain on that house that time cannot clean, that the darkness that entered through whatever door the murderer used on that June night in 1912 never fully left. Whatever you believe about the supernatural, this much is undeniably true. The Villisca Axe murder house feels different to people who enter it. It felt different to me when I researched this case. It feels different to everyone who gets close enough to let it. Villisca never fully recovered from the murders. The town that had prided itself on being the kind of place where nothing bad ever happens was now, permanently, the town where one of the worst things imaginable had happened. In the years immediately following the murders, the social fabric of the town frayed visibly. Neighbors who had been friends for decades looked at each other with new suspicion. Friendships ended when accusations flew, families moved away, businesses closed. The multiple trials of Mansfield, of Kelly, of various other suspects kept the wound open for years. Every new accusation divided the town along new fault lines. Everyone seemed to believe someone different was guilty. The murders became a kind of community-wide Rorschach test, each person seeing in the evidence exactly what they feared or suspected about their neighbors. The Stillinger family never recovered. They lost both their daughters in a single night, daughters who had simply accepted a kind invitation to sleep over at a friend's house. Joseph Stillinger, the girl's father, died within a few years of the murders, a broken man. The Villisca Axe murders had a lasting impact on American law enforcement that is rarely acknowledged but genuinely significant. The catastrophic failure to secure the crime scene led directly to new protocols for crime scene management in Iowa and eventually across the country. The case also contributed to the growing movement to professionalize American policing. In 1912, many small-town police forces were barely more than local volunteers with a badge. The obvious inability of Villisca's local law enforcement to handle a crime of this magnitude made a compelling argument for better training, better resources, and better coordination between agencies. And perhaps most significantly, the Villisca murders helped establish the concept of the serial killer, the idea that a single individual might commit multiple murders across multiple jurisdictions, and that connecting those crimes required a national database in a national law enforcement perspective, ideas that would not be fully realized for another 70 years, but ideas that began to take shape in the wake of cases like Villisca. The Villisca Axe murders have never officially been solved. The case remains open in the records of Montgomery County, Iowa. There is no confirmed perpetrator. There is no definitive answer. Modern investigators who have reviewed the evidence tend to split into three camps. Some believe Frank Jones hired William Mansfield. Some believe Reverend George Kelly acted alone in a state of religious psychosis. And some believe it was an itinerant killer traveling the railroad lines. a proto-serial killer who was never caught and never identified. DNA technology has been applied to what remains of the physical evidence, but after more than a century, the physical evidence is so degraded, so contaminated, so incomplete, that modern forensics cannot provide a definitive answer. The families of the victims have never received justice. The people of Wieliczka have never received closure. The mystery remains exactly what it was on the morning of June 10, 1912, when Ross Moore stumbled out of that house and collapsed in the yard, unanswered, unsolved, unexplained. After studying this case for months, reading every document, every court transcript, every investigator's report, every newspaper article, every paranormal account, I want to share my own conclusion, not a definitive answer, because there is no definitive answer, but my honest assessment of what I believe happened on that June night in 1912. I do not believe Frank Jones and William Mansfield were responsible. The evidence against them was circumstantial, produced under enormous pressure by investigators who needed someone to blame. The acquittal was the right legal outcome. I believe Reverend George Kelly knew more than he ever admitted. His presence in Wieliczka that night, his early morning departure, his later confessions, even if those confessions were ultimately ruled unreliable, all point to a man who was connected to these events in a way that was never fully explained. Whether he was the killer or whether he witnessed something and fled, I believe Kelly carried a secret to his grave, and I think the most frightening possibility, the traveling killer theory, cannot be dismissed. The pattern of similar murders across the Midwest, the methodology that is too consistent to be coincidence, the use of the railroad system that would have made a killer nearly invisible to 1912 law enforcement, it is the explanation that, to me, best fits the evidence. But here is what I know for certain. 8 people, 6 of them children, were murdered in their beds on a warm summer night in Iowa. They were real people, they had names, faces, dreams, futures, they were loved. And whoever killed them walked away free. Joe Moore, Sarah Moore, Herman Moore, Mary Catherine Moore, Arthur Boyd Moore, Paul Vernon Moore, Boyd Moore, Lena Gertrude Moore, Lena Stillinger, Ina Mae Stillinger. 10 names, 10 lives, 2 adults who worked hard and built a life, 8 children who deserved to grow up. The house on East 2nd Street still stands. The beds are still there, the rooms are still dark, and if you walk its halls on a quiet night, if you listen carefully in the children's room, where the small iron beds sit in the darkness, people say you can still hear them, still there, still waiting, still not understanding why the morning never came. The Wieliczka axe murders, June 10, 1912, 8 victims, 0 answers, 112 years of silence from whoever swung that axe and walked away into the Iowa night. If you are brave enough, you can visit the house, you can sleep in the rooms where they died, you can lie in the dark and wait for morning, and maybe, just maybe, in the space between midnight and dawn, you will understand something about that night that no investigator ever could, because some truths are not solved, they are only felt. And yet, even after saying all of that, even after walking you through every suspect, every theory, every piece of evidence, every paranormal account, I find myself sitting here in the quiet, thinking about one thing. The axe. Joe Moore's own axe, the axe he used to chop firewood, the axe he swung on cold winter mornings to keep his family warm, the axe that sat in the cob house in the backyard, ordinary and unremarkable, the way 10,000 other axes sat in 10,000 other backyards across Iowa. Someone walked into that backyard, someone picked up that axe, someone carried it into that house, and someone used it on people who were sleeping, on children who were dreaming. That person walked back out into the Iowa night and disappeared. They breathed the same air as the rest of us. They woke up the next morning. They may have eaten breakfast. They may have read about the murders in the newspaper. They may have even expressed shock and horror along with everyone else. And nobody ever stopped them. Nobody ever looked them in the eye and said, "I know what you did." That thought, that simple, terrible thought, is what has kept this case alive for 112 years. Not the ghost stories, not the paranormal investigations, not the tourist visits or the overnight stays, or the YouTube videos. It is the knowledge that justice was never served, that someone got away with it, completely, perfectly, forever. Let me tell you something that most people do not know about this case, something that investigators discovered and that has largely been overlooked. In the popular retelling of the Wieliczka story. In the weeks before the murders, several residents of Wieliczka reported seeing a strange man, not a local, someone unfamiliar. He was described as middle-aged, roughly dressed, with dark eyes that people said felt wrong somehow, the kind of eyes that you notice without being able to explain why you notice them. This man was seen near the Moore house on more than one occasion. He was seen at the train depot, He was seen walking the residential streets of Wieliczka at odd hours, late in the evening, when most respectable travelers would have been indoors. No one thought much of it at the time. Wieliczka was a railroad town. Strangers passed through constantly. A man hanging around the depot was not unusual. A man walking the streets was not unusual. It was only after the murders, only after 8 people were found dead, that people began to recall the details of this stranger and to wonder. Several witnesses tried to describe him to investigators. Their descriptions were compiled. Sketches were attempted, but in 1912, without photography, without the ability to quickly circulate an image, the strange man simply faded into the past. He was never identified, never located, never questioned. Was he the killer? Was he scouting the neighborhood? Was he watching the Moore family in the days before he came for them? Or was he simply an unremarkable traveler that a traumatized town transformed, in hindsight, into something sinister? We do not know. We will never know. But his shadow falls across this case like everything else. Dark, undefined, and impossible to catch. I want to talk about the children for a moment, because I think, in all the investigation and theory and debate and horror, the children sometimes get lost. They become victims in a story rather than people who actually lived. Herman Moore was 11 years old. He liked baseball. His father coached his team and would beam with pride when Herman made a good play. Herman was old enough to have real opinions about things, to start becoming whoever he was going to be. He never got to find out who that was. Mary Catherine Moore was 10. She sang in the church choir. Neighbors remembered her as a serious girl, the kind of child who listened carefully when adults spoke, who seemed to be absorbing the world with unusual attention. She was going to be something, people said, something remarkable. Arthur Boyd Moore was 7. He was described as funny, genuinely funny, the kind of child who could make a room full of adults laugh without quite meaning to. 7 years old, and already charming the world around him. Paul Vernon Moore was 5. He followed his older siblings everywhere, trying to keep up with them, trying to be part of whatever they were doing. 5-year-olds are always chasing the world just slightly out of their reach. Boyd was 3, just 3 years old enough to have a personality, a laugh, favorite things, young enough that the world was still almost entirely new to him. He had barely started. And Lena Gertrude Moore was 7, the youngest of the Moore children. She had been at the church program that night, performing with her brothers and sisters, sitting in the pew with her family, walking home through the warm summer dark, probably already half asleep on her feet. Lena Stillinger was 12, old enough to be trusted with a sleepover, old enough to help look after her younger sister, old enough to know that a night at a friend's house was something special and exciting. She was 12, which meant she was standing right on the edge of everything, on the edge of growing up, of becoming someone fully formed and fully herself. Ina May Stillinger was 8. She was the one who came along because her older sister came along. She was there because a kind invitation was extended and accepted. She was 8 years old and she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, through no fault of her own or anyone who loved her. 8 years old. These are not statistics. These are not plot points in a horror story. These are children. Real children who laughed and argued and had bad days and good days and grew out of their shoes, and had favorite foods and were afraid of things in the dark and were loved, genuinely, completely loved, by the people who raised them, and they were all gone by morning. Here is something that the paranormal investigators and the ghost hunters and the thrill seekers who visit the Wieliczka house do not always talk about. Something that I think matters more than any cold spot or audio anomaly or camera malfunction. The town of Wieliczka held a funeral for the Moore family on June 12, 1912. 2 days after the discovery of the bodies, the entire town came. Businesses closed, schools closed. The streets were lined with people who had known the Moores, who had eaten at Sarah's table, who had done business with Joe, who had gone to school with the children. 8 coffins lined up in the church where the family had worshipped every Sunday, where the children had performed just 3 nights before. 6 of those coffins were very small. Reverend Ewinches, who had known the Moore family well, conducted the service. He reportedly could not complete his prepared remarks. He stopped several times. He stood at the pulpit and looked out at those 8 coffins and simply could not find the words. There were no words. There are still no words. The entire congregation was weeping. Grown men who had never cried in public in their lives stood in that church and did not try to hide it, because sometimes grief is bigger than dignity. Sometimes what has happened to the world is simply too large to absorb quietly. The Moores were buried in Wieliczka's Sunset Hill Cemetery. Their graves are still there. You can visit them, people do. They leave flowers sometimes, or small toys, near the graves of the children, little acknowledgments that say, "We remember. We have not forgotten. You were real and you mattered and we are sorry for what happened to you." The Stillinger girls were buried separately, returned to their family. Their graves are in a different part of Montgomery County, quieter, less visited. They are remembered too, though perhaps less often than they deserve. I want to address something that has bothered me throughout this entire investigation. Something that I think speaks to the deepest horror of this case. Not the murders themselves, as terrible as they were, but what came after. The people of Villisca spent years pointing fingers at each other, years suspecting neighbors, accusing prominent citizens, dragging people through the courts on insufficient evidence, years letting the pressure of an unsolved case poison relationships and destroy trust. And through all of it, the actual killer, whoever they were, was safe, untouched, perhaps watching, perhaps even amused. There is a particular cruelty in an unsolved murder that goes beyond the tragedy of the victims. It is the cruelty of what it does to the living. It leaves a wound that cannot heal because it has no clean edge. There is no verdict, no closure, no moment where the community can look at each other and say, it was that person. It is over. We are safe now. Instead, there is only the permanent open question, and the permanent low hum of fear and suspicion that comes with it. Villisca lived with that for decades. Many of its residents lived with it for the rest of their lives. The people who were alive in 1912, who knew the Moors, who walked past that house on East 2nd Street every day, they never stopped wondering. They never stopped looking at the people around them and asking, could it have been you? That is, what an unsolved murder does to a community. That is the other victim that never gets counted. The town itself, the sense of safety, the ability to trust, the simple, ordinary peace of living among people you believe you know. Over the past decade, renewed interest in the Villisca case has brought new investigators, new technology, and new perspectives to bear on the evidence. And while no definitive breakthrough has been made, some interesting things have emerged. Researchers studying the pattern of similar Midwestern axe murders from the 1910s have become increasingly convinced that they are looking at the work of a single individual, or possibly two individuals working together. The consistency of the methodology across cases separated by hundreds of miles is too precise, too specific to be coincidental. The covered mirrors, the drawn curtains, the evidence of the killer remaining at the scene after the murders, the use of the victim's own implements rather than a brought weapon, the complete absence of robbery as a motive. Nothing of value was taken from the Moore house. These are not the hallmarks of opportunistic violence. These are rituals, repeated, deliberate, meaningful rituals. What those rituals meant to the person performing them, that is perhaps the darkest question of all, because rituals imply belief. They imply a framework, a logic, however twisted, that made sense to the person carrying them out. Somewhere in the mind of whoever did this was a reason, an explanation, a justification. We do not have access to that mind. We never will. But knowing that it existed, knowing that a human consciousness organized itself around the murder of sleeping families and found in that some kind of meaning, is perhaps the most disturbing thing about this entire case. Let me tell you about the last person to see the Moore family alive, or rather, the last person we know of. A neighbor named Roland Gardner later testified that he had seen a light in the Moore house at approximately 12:30 in the morning on June 10th. He was up late himself. He never said why, and he noticed the light through the curtains. He thought nothing of it. He went to bed. What that light was, and who was creating it, is not known. It may have been the killer, still inside the house, moving from room to room with a lantern. It may have been some other completely innocent explanation. But Roland Gardner, lying in his own bed a short distance from the Moore house, is the last known witness to any sign of activity inside that home. He heard nothing unusual, no screams, no sounds of struggle, no voices, just the quiet of a summer night and a light that burned in a neighbor's window and then went dark. By morning, everyone in that house was gone, and the light never came back on. I have spent a long time with this story, more time than I expected to. There is something about it that refuses to release you. Once it has you, some quality of the tragedy that keeps pulling you back, keeps making you turn it over in your mind looking for the angle you might have missed, the detail that might finally make everything make sense. It does not make sense. That is the honest